Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the Fish and Wildlife Management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing. Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. Joe, we've got an aquatics episode, and I think you're going to sort of bridge the gap between terrestrial and aquatics this week. So what are we going to talk about?
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about aquatics, aquatic-related species. We're going to talk about migration, and I think that most of the talk will focus on migration of waterfowl. We'll have some little inklings of other birds or animals that might be migrating as well, but I thought that it's a good time of year to talk about, waterfowl migration.
Yeah, well, cool. So I guess first off, what is migration? What's that even mean?
Yeah, I think it's a seasonal journey where animals are traversing long distances to go to a different area and kind of enjoy their life. Generally, I think of migration being repetitive, so an animal is going to fly south and then it's going to head back up north or east, west. It can be different directions, sure. But we're going to see kind of that cycle. Some species, it might be multiple generations. So one generation might head south and the next might head north or something like that. But I think almost always with the migration, there's a cycle to it where it's kind of you're starting in one place, you're going to a new place, and you're going back to where you started. So that aspect there I think is important. But, these journeys can be relatively small distances, 100 miles or something, or they can be really long distances. So a lot of the species we're familiar with, Canada geese, mallards, teal, most of these species are probably, somewhere around 3,000 miles, I would guess is average. But it's still pretty far distance
sure.
to be flying. But, that's kind of the average. Some of them can be really far. And so, a bird like an Arctic tern is flying from one pole to the other every single year. And
That's
so they have
crazy.
A 40,000-mile migration. I think I read a statistic that said about 1.5 million miles they can fly in their lifetime. So, that's crazy thinking about. They're a pretty decent-sized bird, but even so, thinking about traversing that far is crazy.
It is. And, there has to be some pretty major adaptations that allow them to undergo that kind of migration too, I imagine.
Yeah, for sure. You see a lot of, changes in eating patterns and things like that where they're able to, be efficient with how they're storing their energy and then efficient in how they're utilizing it too.
Definitely. And other things like wing shape, our migratory birds tend to have longer, narrower wings, yep. Whereas our non-migratory birds tend to have shorter, broader wings if they're a species that's going to do some, fast bursts of flight.
Yep.
We see differences too in their kind of muscle that they use too.
Yeah.
So the migratory species have the red muscle or the dark muscle that's going to be for aerobic activity, and then the species like northern bobwhite quail or prairie chickens, they're going to have more of a white muscle that's made to capitalize on anaerobic or really quick bursts of speed. So lots of different adaptations.
Yeah, their ability to breathe at different altitudes is definitely there. Heart rates. I mean, there's lots of physiological changes in the species of the birds that you're seeing based on their activity. So really cool stuff over time that they build up this ability to migrate.
Very cool. Very cool. So why do birds migrate?
Well, there's a lot of reasons that they do, but they're trying to optimize their habitat. And so trying to find great habitat for breeding or raising the young. And so they're going to head north where they have lots of habitat that's great for doing that. And then, heading south where there's going to be a lot more food in the colder months. That's the main reason, kind of optimizing those two things. There's a little bit of trade-off between, escaping the colder temperatures and things like that. But it's primarily to optimize the conditions for breeding and raising those offspring.
Sure. Well, sort of the alternative to migrating for a lot of species is to hibernate,
yeah,
or just to tough it out, and
sure.
And a lot of our bird species don't necessarily have the adaptations to do either one. So it makes sense that they might migrate like that. So like when a species is going back north, during the summertime, what's the goal there?
Yeah, they're heading up north. They're going to go up to, the northern states or go up to Canada a lot of times. And there's variation there, obviously, but they're finding habitats that have, a lot of wetland type habitats, very scattered pockets where they can safely breed and then raise those offspring with all of the type of habitat and the type of resources that they need to, have high clutch viability. And so a lot of benefits there to going north. And then, there's better feeding. There's more availability of food for them in southern states or in Mexico or South America as they fly south in the winter. And so just trying to optimize where they're at for those different conditions is really what they're trying to do.
Sure. So do all birds migrate?
No, there's two things there. One, certain species don't migrate. They like to stick around certain areas. If you go outside in the wintertime, you're going to hear northern red cardinals around here, or northern cardinals. The red's not part of their name, but red birds, and they're going to be calling, and you'll hear those in the spring as well. Woodpeckers are another common example. And so those are species that stick around. If you think about a woodpecker, that's a great example. They're eating primarily, bugs or invertebrates that are growing in trees. And so those invertebrates are going to be sticking around regardless of whether it's warm or cold. It's not like seeds getting lost when plants stop growing or something like that for the year. And so food availability isn't an issue for a woodpecker or a flicker. They might stick around all the time. So some species aren't going to leave, right? Some species are going to stay around year round, but other species, might decide that they do want to migrate. And so those can be things like songbirds. And so you're going to see birds like orioles are a common one, Baltimore orioles. We start to see in Kansas, dark-eyed juncos will be coming from the north. We're the southern range for a lot of those. Titmice would be another example where, there are species that were the southern range. And so It's not always South America, but some of the other species that we have might fly south too. But there are going to be some species that do migrate. So, waterfowl are a great example there. Teal are moving south. Mallards, Canada geese, you see those big V formations. So lots of species that may or may not head south. And then there are also going to be individuals of each species that do migrate that decide to be resident individuals. And so they might just decide, hey, they want to stick around. They like where they're at. They're going to stick around this year instead of migrating. That's generally a small percentage. But you do have those resident individuals that have a great habitat, a great area that they want to thrive, and they're just going to decide they're not going to migrate.
Sure. I think one of the things that's interesting to me is like within Canada geese, there's a whole subset of the population that doesn't migrate.
Yep.
And, we have seasons that are established to try and target those specific individuals because they can become problematic in urban areas and around golf courses and those sorts of things.
Yeah, they figure out they have a great habitat and they're not going to fly somewhere else. They're going to stay there year round. And, there's a huge human-wildlife conflict area there with those resident individuals. If you're talking about something like geese, we don't really tend to care too much if there's an extra woodpecker or two, but you start to have large accumulation of geese, they can be dirty, they can have nutrient issues. So there's a whole realm where we're trying to manage those resident individuals and how long they're sticking around and what we can do about them.
Yeah, definitely a challenge there. So what cues migration for these species that do migrate?
Yeah, it's primarily daylight. They're going to start to realize that the length of the day is getting shorter, right? And so that's going to cue some of their genetic response that tells them they have a period of hyperphagy where they're just going to eat a ton of food before they decide to take off. And so you're going to start to see that. Hummingbirds are a really common example of this. People that have hummingbird feeders out or hummingbirds around their habitat, if they have, they might have a garden that has a lot of native plants in it, but you start to see a really big peak in activity, and then these birds just kind of take off. And so the primary cue is daylight, but there are some other factors that are going to mix in, and weather is probably the next most common. And so something like a really cold spell coming through with waterfowl, if a pond or a wetland that they're hanging out on freezes over, then they're probably going to go look for a different area. If you get a strong wind that is favorable favorable to push them along and help them on their journey to wherever they're headed, they're going to take advantage of that. So there are some weather conditions, but most of what drives the decision to head out for the year is going to be the day length. So that's kind of the driving factor there.
That makes sense. It's something that is constant, that can be a cue that might allow them to get out of an area before it gets bad enough that they might, be at risk of dying because they get too cold, or that, makes it more challenging for them to get started on that migration.
Yeah. If you waited for a bad weather event, it might be too bad to get to where you're going, right? So good to have a cue that says, hey, you need to start thinking about getting out of here before it does get too bad. That's for sure.
Yeah. One of the other things I think is interesting is how the cold weather fronts can stall out a migration, while it's in process. Sometimes we see during the springtime, if there's a cold front that sets in Nebraska, well, then the snow geese might stall out and hang out here a lot longer than they normally would, because that front's up there just kind of keeping them down where they can get to the food and where they've got open water and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, people that go birding love those events because they'll get some rare species that can show up, and if they have that stall, it gives them a chance to get out and see that species that might be on their life list, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of times, there's a whole dimension of people that are following these migration patterns and trying to time up where the bird's going to be and when. You mentioned the hunters, but there are also people out there that just want to observe them. Lots of really cool opportunities related to migration for sure.
Yeah, polar vortex might not be something that you like if you don't like cold, but if you're a birder, it might be your friend.
Yeah, that's true.
So how, when these birds are going through this process of navigating, from continent to continent or just across smaller areas, how do they navigate? How do they figure out where they're going? And because, they can't see the stars all the time,
right.
and some of them fly at night and those sorts of things.
That's been a big mystery, and just in the last few years, there's been a lot of really good research that has helped provide some insight into that. You mentioned stars, and there is evidence that birds utilize stars or utilize the sun or the moon at different times, and obviously the sun and moon are moving in the skyline, so mainly those stars are kind of what they're utilizing. Things like the magnetic field of the Earth, the poles, it seems to be really important in driving them. Some of it can be learned behavior, so birds often make very similar treks every single year, following the same flyways, the same pattern every year, and they might figure out that, hey, there's a good stop if we go another 10 miles this direction or 10 miles that direction, and there's strong research that shows that individuals that have found those locations will favor them in future years. And so they're using a lot of cues that are there all the time, but then they're learning some behavior, some landmarks along the way that'll kind of help guide them. One of the things we see that can disrupt that is artificial light, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you think about urban areas and leaving lights on, and that can disrupt some of these patterns that we see. And so just be aware of kind of what's going on and how the birds are using these different cues to find their way either north or south, depending on which way they're heading, what time of year it is.
Yeah, well, there's definitely, if you're on social media or sometimes on news outlets and those sorts of things, they'll tell you this is a peak time for migration, so turn off your porch light maybe for the next week, or don't have extra lights on in your business and those sorts of things. So for sure.
That's a real thing. I mean, there's research that's been done on that shows that is a real impact, not just something that's been made up.
So you mentioned a little bit about how much energy they might use, and talked a little bit about that process of hyperphagy. But how do these birds prepare for that migration process? How much energy do they use in those sorts of things?
Yeah, a lot of these birds that are migrating have a lot of adaptations. So you'll see things, they'll go out and they'll eat a lot. That hyperphagy just means eating more than they normally do, right? And so they'll go out and eat a lot. They also have the ability to store fat around their organs that you don't necessarily see in non-migratory species. So they have the ability to pack on a lot of weight. How much they're going to pack on is going to depend on the individual and the species, but it's common to see a 40% increase right before you take off for this migration. And the flip side's true too. Flying 3,000 miles or more, you can see a 40 or 50% loss in body weight or body condition after that. So losing a large amount of energy is also something that's very common. And birds, they might make some stops. Most species make some stops and refuel or eat a little bit or rest a little bit along the way. So there's some opportunities to get some more nutrients, but a vast majority of that energy that they're going to expend comes before they take off for sure.
So, with a trip like that where they're potentially losing 40 to 50% of their body mass, I would guess that there's some costs there in terms of survival too.
Yeah, migration does come at a cost. And so on the low end, 20 to 25% of all the species that migrate in a given year aren't going to make it back the next year.
Wow.
And there are some species, on a bad year, you might lose 75 or 80% of the individuals that are migrating. So it can be a really high impact. And dark-eyed juncos and ruby-throated hummingbirds, I know, are two species that would be in Kansas area that tend to have those higher mortality rates. But overall, as a group, 20 to 25% loss. The benefit of having more reserves in those colder months, I think, outweighs that from an evolutionary standpoint, or we wouldn't see, long-term see this pattern occur. So,
sure.
But yeah, it's definitely a risk to try to traverse that big of a distance for sure.
Probably encounter some sources of mortality that they wouldn't normally encounter, like, maybe running into a building that's lit up at night and those sorts of things.
Yeah, that's another thing. And so, there's a whole scientific group that studies building collisions, right? And so a lot of those occur during the day, but at night too, you can see large numbers of birds that are getting hit by buildings or other structures that can increase that mortality rate artificially for sure.
We're talking about, different species or even groups of species that are flying. Do they follow, big broad paths when they do that sort of thing or?
For the most part. And so, those would be a big path would be called a flyway. And there are 4 main flyways that are identified in the United States. And so the Pacific Flyway is out by the Pacific Ocean. We're in the Central Flyway. The Mississippi Flyway is east, follows the Mississippi River, and then you have the Atlantic Flyway along the Atlantic coast. And so, those are kind of the big paths. And so think about it maybe as a highway, that's where most of the birds are going to be. That doesn't mean that every bird is only going to drive down that one area. There can be some overlap there. But those flyways are really important areas because you have such big groups that are kind of utilizing those areas primarily. So in Kansas, I mentioned we're part of the Central Flyway, and you see a lot of different birds that are flying along, down that path. I think, a lot of people thinking about migration focus on, waterfowl this time of year because hunters are out and trying to track that pattern. But like I mentioned earlier, a lot of wading birds utilize these flyways and the habitats along them. Songbirds do too. So really important areas for birds that are migrating long distances.
Well, and I mean, with waterfowl in particular, the flyways basically line up with breeding populations, right? And so hunting regulations for the entire country are set based on those migratory pathways that they take in those flyways. So,
sure.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, and following that. And, another thing we haven't talked about yet is plumage changes, but understanding, birds might look a little different depending on when they're migrating too. So, but yeah, the breeding patterns and all the harvest regulations all line up with these flyways because that's the main area that we're going to see most of these species.
Cool. So we've talked a lot about this north to south migration or south back to north migration. Are there other types of migration that we can see?
Yeah, other directions are common too. So, you might see east to west, you might see pole to pole. So there are it's not always perfectly north to south, but, that kind of tends to be the most common around here. Another good example might be altitudinal migration, where you see changes in elevation. And so a species like a greater sage grouse would be a good example of prairie falcons where they're not necessarily traversing large geographic regions, but they might go from a high elevation in a mountainous region to a low elevation in a mountainous region. A cool fact there is that a lot of those changes are often done walking. So, we think about migration being flying long distances, but these groups might just decide that they're going to walk to a lower elevation, when snow comes in, or to a higher elevation once it starts to warm up. So you can see changes like that. Another really common example would be penguins. And so penguins swim to other locations when they're migrating, and so you can see long distances traversed in manners other than just flying. So lots of other good examples out there. There's just a few of them.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, even within mammals, we see that altitudinal migration sometimes. Elk and other species might be at high elevations during the summertime, but then once the winter snows set in, it's hard for them to make a living up there, and so they come down to lower elevations where they can get to food and water and move around.
Yeah, I don't know if a spawning run, but fish can move, hundreds of miles in a river or stream. I guess that's a type of migration, right? And
sure.
There are species that go out into the ocean and then come back into fresh water to end their life and reproduce. So a lot of species are migrating. We're talking about birds today primarily, but there's a lot of terrestrial species, a lot of aquatic species that are also able to migrate really long distances. So it's a common example in the aquatic kingdom where you start to see these patterns emerge.
I wonder, and you would know this, I'm just thinking about it, like even within a very large reservoir, we see, different species that might utilize different parts of a reservoir at different times of the year, different depth profiles, and all those sorts of things. I guess, could we consider that small-scale migration?
That's true. That altitudinal migration we just talked about, going from, I don't know if it has a name, but talking about different depths that animals use. We've talked a lot about how the oxygen levels change with depths, and so at 4 degrees Celsius is when water is most dense, but it's going to hold water or hold oxygen at those deeper areas. But fish might be deeper in the winter, trying to stay in that relatively warmer habitat, and then come up to the shallows later. So, man, when you start thinking about it like this, it got me all excited. You're talking about fish again, Drew.
I think there's all kinds of parallels between critters that live in water and critters that live on land, and these different life history strategies that when you start opening your mind up and thinking broadly about it, there's lots of different critters that use the same strategies, maybe not to the same extreme.
Right.
But
swimming from one end of a reservoir to another, that happens commonly, right? And so and that's a lot of why you might go catch a white bass run or a wiper run around here this time of year is, they might be moving up to a different area. There might be a food source, whatever, but moving around, it's a different term. I'm not sure we'd use the term migration to move to a different habitat. I don't know where that balance is, but thinking about it on a reservoir level where, you see clear movement within that body of water, that's an interesting way to think about it.
Well, people have accused me of being interesting in multiple ways. So
I think that's a compliment, Drew.
I'm not sure. So, when we think about these species that might migrate across a state or within a broad region like a flyway, or even from that would cross international boundaries and oceans and those sorts of things, I imagine that having organizations that are responsible for making conservation type decisions for these species is pretty important.
Yeah, one of the big risks for the getting back to the waterfowl or the migrating bird side of things has been the loss of wetland habitats, right? And so you're getting they're reducing the areas that these birds can stop and have a rest or recharge their eating or whatever they want to do. And so managing the habitat that is out there is really important. In Kansas, the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks does a really good job of this. They're out flooding habitats. A lot of that's hunter management or hunting management, but those hunting dollars that are being put in for licenses and the management actions that are being done directly benefit all the wading birds or the songbirds or other species, or, not every duck is going to be harvested. So lots of benefits to the hunting there that you might not see. Things like the United States Fish and Wildlife Service is out managing wildlife refuges. So Quivira is a really common, Quivira National Wildlife Refuge is a really common one in Kansas. That and Cheyenne Bottoms, which is managed by KDWP, those are probably two of the most important stops in the Central Flyway that we're in. And every year, there's a lot of hunters that go and utilize these, but there's also a lot of people that just go outdoors and go hike or something like that. And there's a ton of birders that, there's unique species that show up and they hightail it to these areas to cross them off their list. So lots of benefits to government organizations like that. There's also some nonprofit groups, and so something like Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited, those types of groups also putting a lot of money and resources, time, habitat management, stuff like that out to manage these areas, where these species are able to go and we focus, again, I think we tend to think of these primarily as hunting organizations, and that's part of what they do, but those dollars go so much further than that. It's really important for the whole conservation group, right? And it's really important for this migration pattern. So these groups that are managing these wetlands and working on this habitat, I think, just doing a lot of good that extends further than we really think that it does.
Sure. And, another one that's really important in there, too, is the United States Department of Agriculture.
Yeah.
There's specific conservation practices within CRP that are designed to preserve and manage the habitat around wetlands, all throughout the Playa Lakes regions and those sorts of things. So that can be really important too.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of groups out there for sure, but lots of good work going into it. And when you think about animals that are traversing these large distances, any one group can't do it, right? And so there's international groups that I'm sure we're missing that are doing a lot in the breeding habitat. Think about up in Canada. I'm sure that they have a great network up there that's doing a lot for the breeding habitat. And I know they're banding waterfowl and they're following populations up there. So lots being done. These groups, we mentioned a few. We just barely scratched the surface, right? There's a ton of individuals that are doing a lot of great work, and if I left them out, that's not to downplay their importance. Just pointing out a few of the top ones that I'm familiar with.
Yeah, for sure. Just a couple more that are coming to the front of my mind here in Kansas that are important. Nature Conservancy, Playa Lakes Joint Venture. All of those would be really important groups too. There's lots. The habitat management, the conservation, all of those groups are just vitally important for now and the future, right? And so we're talking about the migratory birds today, but the benefits extend. It's such a rippling effect, right? You can be out managing for ducks, and the benefits of that are going to hit every which way you can think about. We just talked about terrestrial species. We talked about fish, and we're again the benefits, how far they reach, is just fun to think about if you spend a little time doing it. Absolutely. Another thing, too, as you were talking about that came to mind for me is, a lot of the habitat management practices or conservation practices that we think about when we're looking at maintaining and managing wetlands, they also benefit agricultural producers.
Yeah.
We can, if you're a producer that has a playa or an ephemeral wetland of some sort in a field that you're trying to farm, putting that to permanent cover, not having to farm something which you're going to lose a crop on, maybe 2 out of 3 years or something like that, can be a game changer in terms of profitability. Not farming those marginal acres, and at the same time the wildlife benefit from it, water quality benefits from it, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, water quantity is something that's really in the news nowadays, and there's been a lot of research that has shown that if you allow those areas where you're not necessarily going to get big production out of, but you do things to manage it, that can increase your profitability, lower input costs, but also the crops that you do raise can have benefits from that too. So, a lot of times it's perspective, right? You can look at that and see it as a problem, or you can look at it and see it as an opportunity that habitat's there, and you get the opportunity to make it whatever it can be. So fun to think about as you're managing the agricultural habitat for sure.
Definitely fun to think about. And this has been a fun topic for me to think about, Joe. So thanks for bringing this to us today. And thanks everybody for listening. And we'll talk to you again in a couple of weeks with a completely terrestrial episode.
Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.